Okay, welcome everyone to the Secure Stage Strategy Review Q&A portion. Uh, if you're watching this video on YouTube and you've not watched the pre-record that goes over all the details, I highly recommend you check that out and come back and watch this video after you've seen the presentations. But with that, we can hand it over to Sam for the first question.
All right, thanks. So the Biden administration in the United States recently put out a new executive order about cybersecurity and improvements they want to see made in the United States. What are your all's thoughts on that? How is that going to affect GitLab? Are we going to do things differently, or going to know how that impacts GitLab?
So I'm still waiting to see this report that came out within 60 days. There's supposed to be a new report on all of the different areas of secure that we focus on. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that report. We have already seen some of the outcomes from NIST's SBOM focus. There's some links there that you can dig into. But effectively, the government's going to mandate FSBOM solutions. So I think that will be fascinating to see how that rolls out. Again, like a lot of this is still very early, and we haven't seen a lot of details from NIST. I will say in general, I think NIST is going to become a lot more important outside of the government and may even become more of an industry standard. When you look at their existing frameworks, they've got one for cybersecurity, for risk management, and privacy. I think they're generally a bit misunderstood. They're more of a framework of how to think about those things, not here's the 27 items you need to go and do. And I think a lot of companies see NIST, they see the 20-page PDF of all of the requirements, and they're like, this is too much. I can't do all of this. When instead, you're supposed to look at all of the requirements and decide what is applicable to your business. So I think we'll see all of these things come together into a more practical solution that may become more of an industry standard. I think for me, all of this kind of comes down to accessibility. If we're going to expand the usage of all of these tools, they need to be more accessible. They need to be easier to run, to configure, to understand the results, to make changes based on those results. So that's really sort of where I hope to see NIST end up going.
Yeah, I agree. The SBOM seems to be increasingly important. On the container security side, we've increased the priority of adding in a listing of operating system packages into the dependency list that we already generate today. We already have a good listing of all of those dependencies. We're just missing the operating system packages. That's the one thing that's holding us back from having a complete SBOM inside of GitLab. So we are planning to work on that probably later this year. We don't have a great time estimate for when that'll be made available yet, though.
I think it's going to raise the importance of access controls as well, and also of audit, understanding who changed what, where, when, keeping track of that. And also, there's a piece in there about sharing information better between, I think it'll be not just between agencies, but between, commercial and government. And so we need to think about what information we need to retain and share to be the most useful. And I think to Taylor's point about NIST, I think at some point it'll be like, how with electrical cords, there's the UL certification, and you don't buy something if it doesn't have the UL certification. I think there will be something like that comes out of all of this as well. And it's not just going to affect the federal agencies. It's going to have a trickle down across all of commercial and globally as well.
Hopefully the dog has now stopped barking. My thought is, much like the usual, it's going to be kind of a mess at first as people try and scramble to figure out exactly what everything means and what's going to pass their internal audits or their external audits to follow this. It's going to start with the feds and then anybody who supplies to the feds, and like Cindy said, trickle down from there. And there's so many standards out there. I think it's going to be confusing and frustrating to people. So where I think we're going to get to in the future, hopefully, fingers crossed, is that we can help with educating people, much like many standards, as Taylor said. It's not a checkbox. You can't just say, I did this one particular thing, check, I've done that. It's more about, you need to make sure you've done something to cover this point. You need to make sure you have a comprehensive list of these things. And so if we can educate people and say, here's how we're helping you meet these pieces and making sure we have a comprehensive picture of each one of those, we can help you cover all those points, but we really can't be a checkbox. And honestly, in my opinion, anybody who says that they can checkbox you into this is not being truthful.
Yeah, so to add additional color to what Cindy just said, there are groups today who are working on kind of what the UL equivalent thingy would be. And one that I actually am a working group chair for is NetSec Open. They're currently working like through the IETF to define security standards. So like what is actually a next generation firewall? What is actually a web application firewall? And then they're actively engaged with USA PubSec agencies like NIST, NSA, and so forth, because the founders of that group did work in like FIPS and SCAP and all the things that are government numbers, and so, or government requirements. So I think GitLab has a unique position in all of this, and we can help define those, and then that will then give us the additional exposure, which I'm hoping we can get via the stuff that the government's passing today, or mandating, depending on the situation.
Great, thanks for those answers.
And then I think Lucas, it's over to you.
Yeah, so looking over kind of how our categories have expanded recently, we have more things that I kind of struggle with what we'd call these. So I said detection categories, but we have things like code quality coming into the SaaS group, and kind of a distinction between, I said dev container scanning findings, maybe it's pre-production container scanning findings versus live findings. And we kind of previously kind of funneled all this into the vulnerability management category and kind of treat everything in the same synonymous way. So I'm kind of curious if we're going to be pursuing that strategy going forward, or if we're going to be differentiating more. Code quality is something that, as Taylor mentioned, it's kind of tricky, where you can detect things that are like more like an empty conditional was more of a runtime error, or something that's kind of more bug prone. I don't know if we consider that to be a security issue, or if we're kind of like differentiating those and considering the technology is kind of aligned internally.
Yeah, so we're actively investigating this with code quality right now. Becca's running an excellent solution validation where we're getting a lot of feedback about how customers and internal users understand code quality and its relationship to security. In general, some of the highlights that we've seen thus far is that they don't see those on equal playing fields, and even within secure, they don't see criticality as even across all of our detection capabilities. So it's kind of made me pause trying to directly integrate code quality with secure initially. I will say we're definitely trying to streamline the experience between all of these. So code quality recently added inline notifications for code quality findings within the left gutter of code files within MRs. That's something that we're actively exploring bringing to secure for any findings that have specific line numbers. So there's a link to an issue there where we're exploring that, but I think it's more of trying to make sure that the user experience contextually makes sense, but not necessarily putting all of the different findings on the same sort of scale of importance.
Yeah, it's probably worth noting too that, to your question, Lucas, like things are going to get really broad really quickly as we continue to look at it. The one thing I do think is the easier part of this discussion is code quality, and I say that because like that's the way the industry is actually moving. We've been in a situation where the answer to someone's question of code quality was actually SAST, as opposed to a traditional code quality scanner. We also saw that trends in the Gartner Magic Quadrant survey that makes the report thingy that we're in, and in that there were questions that were more code quality questions versus security questions, and so that's the reason why Taylor and I explored moving the category over when Verify reached out. It's probably the easier one to talk to, as opposed to like even some of the load testing and unit testing that is being built over there does blow the line too. I don't think it's as crisp of a story. And Taylor, you nod your head. I'm guessing you agree with that statement.
Yeah,
So I'll
so
just
add related to the, sorry, David, did you have more?
No, I think that was Matt who's reading his answer next.
Yeah, dude. Sorry, Sam. You skipped ahead a couple. I was just going to say, from the vulnerability management perspective, I think we've tried to maintain flexibility. So whatever we determine should be security versus quality, we'd like to try to make sure that that's integrated into the same experience. And I don't want to mention it too much. Sam's got his part in here, but I've been working with him in particular on the production side, because vulnerabilities where they occur is probably important as part of the workflow, but we don't want to duplicate these experiences. So we don't have multiple different copies of the same thing to ultimately accomplish the same task.
Yeah, that's a good summary, Matt. I mean, we're working through those designs right now for the production vulnerabilities. Feedback's welcome. It's not an easy problem to solve because we're scanning other things, really, other objects. We're scanning clusters, or in the future, we want to scan images that are in GitLab's container registry. And so there's kind of a balance of how much do we show vulnerabilities associated with that object in context of that object, and how much do we keep the experience centralized. The answer may be some of both, but those designs aren't super simple. Same thing when it comes to terminology and naming for, how do you separate out the different places where we're doing our scanning. So, again, we're working through the designs right now for that. So it's very timely to capture any feedback that you may have.
Yeah, I think, Matt, I caused confusion. I didn't jump ahead as so much as I was commenting on one of the other things above, but the comment that I think you're referring to, Matt, is more for everyone who's not aware, we've been talking about adding a new category called attack surface management. It doesn't directly fit into your question, Lucas, so much as it speaks to what are we going to do as we continue to expand. And so what we're looking to do with that is begin to detect vulnerabilities within production that's not the container scanning component. So think of automated pen tests against people's environments, automatic detection of new things spun up that now need to be assessed to know their risk. And so right now we're working on the direction page for that. And when I'm done with it and Matt's good with what I've said, we can throw it in the secure channel so everyone can see it. It's a category we wanted to add 2 years ago almost at this point. And then we put it on hold, as we put a lot of our grandiose plans on hold about 18 months ago. But I do expect we're going to hop into that in the next couple of months here. And I think it's an exciting way to show that we can provide visibility for a customer across their entire environment, not just the stuff we're scanning the pipeline, not just what we're doing in production, but like closing that loop completely and using data to feed between the two sides.
Well, I guess I'll just jump into the next question, which is like that's a really good pivot to this, which is, I know that we talked about this during the last strategy, which was a quarter ago, something like that. But it was for a little while a hot topic on how far we can move out of CI, because it's kind of a bit of an artificial constraint on a lot of our tools right now, which has actually been interesting discussing that in some of the engineering conversations, because it's provided some like good utility in terms of how to build very self-contained tools for like the vet project. But some examples of moving out of CI would be like web ID support, or digging deeply into like kind of hooks around push rules for the repos. So I'm just curious if there's any changes in direction from last time we talked about that.
Okay, so I got the first one there, and this actually is a big change since the last time we had it a quarter ago. is that the ops section and the verify team are looking to explore what they're calling a scanner group. I've been calling it serverless runners because that's how I think of it as. It's no longer using the CI pipeline, but able to run a scan against, in their case, unit tests, in our case, like a SAS scan or something that can be run outside the pipeline easily. And I linked to their issue where they've been discussing whether they should create it or not. But they're seeing that as something they may need to do in the future. And I would see us working closely with them on that. Everyone else has very great examples of why that would be a good thing. So I think I'll hand it over to Taylor first to kind of vocalize his.
So on the first point, VR has explored this area in particular with a POC that they called Leftimus, which is basically creating a language server that could run our analyzers and be plugged into IDEs. It works. It was fascinating to see it run. It's something that I think is really interesting. When I think about how do we expand past CI, like we've long defended this stance that IDE integration isn't the point to do a lot of this security enforcement. But I think this comes down to more of a what level of sophistication are you looking to run? I think simple checks make sense to run in IDEs. You don't want to slow down that IDE experience. You don't want to bloat it. So for those simple checks, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like secret detection is something that is relatively light and can be done in line pretty simply. More advanced, like generating abstract syntax trees, doing advanced language compilation, and looking at intra-procedural and extra-procedural security vulnerabilities, like that slows things down. So to me, this comes down to a few different things. One is, how do you trigger it? Can it run automatically? Do you have to set it up? Does it require lots of configuration, et cetera? And then how fast does it run? Right now, we're seeing a lot of people focus on the how fast does it run. We've gotten some demos from some of our competitors on some of their new next gen stuff, and they're focused primarily on how fast does it run. And to me, like that is really important when you start looking outside of that CI context. I think the piece is that we're also starting to see IDEs move into the cloud with things like CodePods and other solutions. We've got our own version of this. GitHub has their version of it. I haven't seen developers buy into it holistically yet. It's going to be interesting to see if that happens, because that kind of answers some of the question of how much compute do I have to be able to run all of these additional types of checks, and what is that user experience. So there's a lot of things that I think kind of go into this that we've got to sort of start thinking about. So that's kind of where my head's at.
That's kind of an interesting point too about compute, because another thing I was thinking about with this is we kind of have a large stick to wield when we do things like change our templates, because doing things like triggering more detection rules or longer detections have like a direct impact on customer CI minutes. Like that's what we're burning through when we increase the scope of our tools. So I don't know, like that's also the product we're selling. And I'm actually curious. I don't know if we hear from customers often that you're using too much of our CI minutes, but the effect on compute is an interesting one.
I mean, I'll just make a quick comment that was something that when we moved SaaS down to core, we are making money off of that via CI minutes. And we have in general not really heard feedback from customers that your scans run too slow. I mean, the stat that I use is 95% of our customers have SaaS scans that run in less than 5 minutes. And that's pretty accessible. Now, I think, if we start tripling, quadrupling the time it takes to run our security, that's where we start having problems.
Yeah,
so in other words,
there has
talking
been
about
some.
test.
Yeah, I was going to say there's been some pushback on, not on SAST, but DAST, fuzz testing, and so forth taking a while. Even one customer, which I think Nicole loves to death, talked about how long it takes to run an SCA scan, and that not fitting into their time to release. And so, Lucas, I think you've lucked out that SaaS runs really quickly, and then there's the other ones that need to build an app first, or let's get a binary, and they can take 10, 15, 20 minutes, or in the case of us testing, like infinite in time. So
Yeah, well, and that's why this has actually been something that's very important to DAST for a while. We started looking at this back over a year ago when we first started talking about on-demand scans and how we would run those. And we ended up just integrating it into a pipeline, but this has always been something that we've wanted to do. And it's even more important with fuzzing, with continuous fuzzing, not having that within the CI framework. But it sounds like Verify is actually working to solve it, and I'll be engaging with them to see how we can do this. But it's just with how slow DAST and fuzzing run, and the fact that we're looking at running applications that are outside of a pipeline. Usually, you can integrate it into the pipeline, but it can cause some issues with slowness. So it's important for my side of the fence.
And then from my side too, we have a supporting step in this direction. Right now, vulnerability management is tied pretty linearly to the pipelines. We require those artifacts to drive the rest of the workflow. But we are hoping in the next milestone, we'll be releasing the ability to create a vulnerability record via API. So this is really important because now you can put information at a project level, which will roll up to the group level, and it can come completely from outside the system. So we're using this to support actually a manual form just for entry, right? Like you might have an internal report or taking it from a bug bounty program, for instance. So we're going to have to do more of these things to support all these non-CI use cases.
You can skip
Cindy,
me.
you had that?
Well, you can. I was just making a point there, but we can go on to Nicole.
So something it's not a change. We've been wanting to get there for a while, but I'm sure everybody knows priority is enough humans. But we want to be able to have, when a new CV comes in and we know that you have an existing project dependency, to be able to immediately tell you, like, take a look at this. And so that is something not related to a pipeline that we would like to get to. No timelines though, because who knows what's going to happen in the next 6 months.
Well, and just to note, some of that might be accomplishable. We may be doing that for you actually, Nicole, because if you can set up scheduled scan policies, and then if you can also set them to generate an alert when new vulnerabilities are discovered.
Yeah, I want to completely skip the scan. I don't even want it to be a scheduled scan. Just we want to know whenever the little auto remediation bot, when he makes it out to production, when the CV list updates, look at the diff, like the new updates, and then check that against your SBOM. So this is going to be like following the SBOM project, and then just tell you right away. So I want 0 pipelines involved, just the little bot doing its duty to warn you of danger.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
And kind of along the same lines, I'm wondering if we have an opportunity to do some things without a scan, just in terms of here's approved code, containers, what have you, that can be used or that are enforced that they must be used for a given project. I think some customers have asked for that, and I know that
that's more of a policy thing, which I want to work more closely with Tim Rizzi on, because he's going to be doing that dependency firewall and everything, and I want to make sure we're very tightly aligned so that there's consistency of user experience and rule sets there. But that's definitely policies will be coming, and hopefully Tim and I can scheme and plot on that one. But to your point, being able to say, we allow these, we don't allow these, other ones ask me or ask somebody.
Looks like I have the next one too. So I'm just wondering if we can somehow more closely tie the process automation with the policy automation. So what I'm thinking of here is there's 2 parts to the policy, right? There's a policy that says thou shalt scan everything with SAST, right? That would be a policy. Or we only scan these or those or at a particular time. And then there's the policy of things like we break a build when there's a critical vulnerability found. So there's what you do when a policy is violated or triggered, or what have you, however you want to word that. It seems like we do a lot around the trigger, but not as much around applying the control. And I think back to the software supply chain issue, I think that that's going to become more important around control of that end-to-end software factory. And so anything that we can do to help customers put those guidelines in place and automate the application of those policies would be really important. And I'm just wondering if we've thought through how we might do that.
Yeah, so I can take that one. We just barely got allocated an additional headcount to focus on security approval specifically. And so we're planning to cover all of that as part of our policy editor. And we're actually just starting work on that security approval piece. So the way that'll look is when you go to create a policy, you'll have two options. You can create either a scan execution policy or a scan result policy, which I think are the two sides of the coin that you're talking about there. So if a scan or execution policy would govern things like when scans are required to run, if a pipeline's run, then require SAS to run, whereas a scan result policy would give more granular, requirements around when do we allow the pipeline or fail the pipeline, when do we require approval, and what conditions, how many critical vulnerabilities or high vulnerabilities in detected by which scanners will cause those conditions to be triggered. So we're planning to cover all of that holistically under the security policy umbrella. It'll just be a different type of security policy that users can create.
Cool. That's great.
Okay, so we've reached the end of the written questions. Is there any questions anyone still has you would like us to go over? Okay, I will take that everything else made total sense and you have no more questions and we're doing an awesome job. So what I'll say is thank you all for attending Sync. Thank you for adding your questions. And we look forward to continuing to do this with you every quarter. Bye, everyone.